Chapter 16. Rain slapped the newspaper on her father's desk. They arrested him. That man would be dead if it wasn't for Victor, but they arrested him and made all these silly accusations. Her father looked up from the book he was reading and glanced between her and the newspaper. He raised an eyebrow asking for permission, then picked up the newspaper to peruse the article when she waved for him to pick it up. The article was accompanied by a dragon fighting a knight. Bones of past victims scattered around the brave knight. She had seen this image before in many of the newspapers. It seemed they shared plates as well as stories. Dragons weren't enemies of humans for centuries, but whenever they wanted to vilify them, they would remind people of the dragon's past or that they were invaders. Dragons were actually refugees. Their own planet was no longer habitable. Earth had been their only option. Her father asked, "Are you going to go to the trial?" "There won't be space and I'm working on that day." Her voice revealing that she already felt defeated. She had no control over the magistrate, and Maines would have been the one to report on the case findings. She knew from the work in the newspapers that he would probably have Victor accused with all the murders. Eleanor, Sebastian, and probably Sir Laurie. Though she doubted he would lump in Markham. That was a loose end she could still explore if she could only find the material he was using to blackmail his victims with. Her father raised an eyebrow. "Charles will be there, why don't you call on him and see if you can be his escort or something?" She didn't like using her godfather for things like this. It wasn't essential for her to see the trial. It was a foregone conclusion that he would be convicted. The newspapers were already speculating on the date of the execution. Her father finished reading the article and asked, "How did they get so many details about the attack?" "It is rare they are this effuse on the actual event," Rain grunted. "The real attacker is the one speaking to the press." Her father leant back in his seat. "I think you have to go to the trial. If there is a conspiracy against Victor, then they might reveal more at the trial." She winced. From her father's words, he expected her to exonerate Victor after his death. Feeling powerless was her least favorite emotion, and it made her sharp. "It won't change anything." She sniffed as she held back tears. She knew what the outcome of the trial would be, and it wasn't going to be a good ending for Victor. With Harlan here, they might intervene, but unlikely. It would cause more trouble to rescue Victor from the law than it would have been to merely get rid of him if he really was the attacker. Her father asked, "You care about him?" She didn't want to admit her feelings as they were too raw and new. Her disability had closed the door on a relationship. To allow her heart to feel was like moving an old cart, but once moving it gained momentum. "He isn't too bad for a dragon." Her father looked thoughtful, and that only worried her. She left him deep in thought. She had to find a way to save Victor. He was innocent, and it was her job to make sure only the guilty paid. First, she would try her godfather, but she was doubtful he would have any power in this situation. He had told her once he could do less for her now that she was an officer rather than more, as he couldn't seem to favor her over the others. For this she would plead. Rain tugged at his coat as they settled into their seats in the Old Bailey. She was agitated as they had to wait for the other formalities before they even got to Victor's case. Charles, on the other hand, was relaxed as he did these almost every other day. "It is nice to have you along, dear. You do know this is serious. A man's life is on the line." She had laid her problem in front of her godfather. He now knew everything she did. Even her suspicions of Maines. He had confirmed that there was little he could do. Maines held the same amount of power as him in the police force, so he couldn't arrest him without solid proof, and even then, he would have to convince the governor to also back the arrest warrant and conviction. They had never had someone at such a high position go rogue, and there was no precedent to dealing with it. Charles shrugged. These things tend to iron themselves out. Especially for a dragon. "I'm sure that if the Empress isn't happy with the outcome, she will step in." His optimism annoyed her, especially since he knew how dire the situation was. "Not in time. If they sentence him to death, he will be dead before the Empress can do anything." Though she did wonder if the Emperor would something. Charles raised an eyebrow and asked, "Tell me again why you are so sure he isn't the one that is attacking people." Her heart sunk. If he didn't believe her with just what she had seen, then even with solid evidence, he might not move on it. "I told you, I was there." Her voice low but adamant. She didn't want anyone else to hear her. "And of course, because you are female, they don't believe you. Why didn't you take Larkin with you?" It was clearer now that Charles was aware of people's views of women and had protected her without her even realizing it. Maybe he wasn't as ambivalent to the situation, but he also wasn't going to be the knight in shining armor that was going to solve all her problems. When it came to Maines and Victor, she was on her own. She sighed and settled into the seat. They would have to stop talking soon as the session started. Rain felt a little guilty that she had left Larkin out, but she didn't want him to ruin his reputation amongst the other officers if he supported her while she went on a hunt for one of their own. But she had to give Charles another reason for not including her partner. "Larkin is seeing a lady." "I didn't want to interrupt his courting for a hunch," he hummed to himself as he thought, but he didn't divulge if he had come to a conclusion on Victor's guilt and the session was starting, so she would have to wait. By the time it was Victor's turn to appear before court, she was on the edge of the seat and her leg bounced up and down in anxious energy. Charles reached forward and rested his hand on her leg, reminding her to hide her concern. Her heels clicked on the wooden floors sharply just as Victor was guided into the room and placed in the pen. Victor glanced around at people. They had cuffed him and placed something around his neck. She knew of these devices as there were a set in the yard, but she had never seen them even taken down, let alone used. They were supposed to keep a dragon trapped in his human form, and they must work as Victor didn't walk with his usual arrogance. She would even risk saying he was scared. Her hands clamped around her knees as she stopped herself from rushing to his defense. The magistrate called out for attention as everyone who had an excuse to be here had wheedled their way into the bailey. He droned through the accusations, and when the magistrate added in Sebastian and Eleanor's deaths, she knew things were not going to go well. The trial was less than an hour, and mostly that was because people argued over how the Empress would see the outcome of the trial. The only one who had presented evidence was Maines, and there had been no counsel for Victor. He could clearly afford one, but she wondered if it would have made a difference even if he had won. Everyone had convicted Victor before they had come to court. Rain looked around for Harlin and his dragon hunter wife, Lala. She eventually spotted them on the other side of the bailey. They must have snuck in as they were standing in the doorway. All the seats had already been taken. Harlin stood with his arms crossed over his chest. Lala frowned at the proceedings, but that could be in concentration to make out the several different conversations that took place on the floor. It was clear they weren't planning to make any move or give an opinion on what the Emperor of the Dragons would think of the humans trying and executing one of his own. When Victor was convicted and sentenced to death, the air left her lungs and she felt lightheaded. She had known it was coming, but when the door shut on the inevitable, it crushed her. Chapter 17. It was harder to find Harlin than she had expected. He didn't have a home in Londinium and he hadn't been staying with Victor. Apparently, dragons were territorial, and unless they were in the same collection, they never cohabitated. In the end, she found Harlin staying at a posh hotel. Nervous, she straightened her coat before she knocked on the door. The adjustment did little to put her straight as the rush to find Harlin and Lala had discombobulated her. As an afterthought, she patted at her hair to make sure everything was still in place as she waited for the door to open. Lala answered the door. Seemingly unsurprised to have a female Bobby at her door, she stepped back silently, inviting her inside. Lala was no longer masquerading as a lady and wore leather leggings with a multitude of weapons strapped to her. Harlin asked, "Who is it?" "Victor's mate." Lala called back to Harlin. Rain had introduced herself at the ball, so Lala knew her name. It bothered Rain that she had managed to acquire a new label. Rain coughed. "We aren't mated." It frightened her that there was a silent yet in that answer. Lala must have heard it as well as she raised her eyebrows. Rain wasn't sure where Lala had heard that Victor had offered for her. But since their job was to investigate, it actually gave her hope that they were good at their job. Harlan came into the room from the dressing room. He was buttoning up his top and asked, "What does she want?" Rain didn't prevaricate. "We have to save Victor." Lala sighed. Maybe she felt like Rain, genuinely sad at the outcome of the trial and the situation they all found themselves in. "We can't. We'd love to, but there has been trouble here already. The humans keep accusing us that we interfere in England too much. If we were on the continent, they wouldn't pretend and just acknowledge that they can't do anything without the dragons interfering." Harlan let out a pleased sound and said, "You are sounding like me, love." He finished dressing and ran his hand through his hair as the entirety of his ablutions. Lala ignored his interruption and said, "It has to be a human who interferes here." Rain was almost too angry to hear the undertone of Lala's words. She paced and came back a little calmer. "Are you saying I should rescue him? I would ruin my career." Lala's eyes softened. "Is he worth it? Is a man's life worth it?" Harlan added unhelpfully, "Dragon." Lala flapped a hand at him to urge him to silence as she kept her gaze on Rain. Rain let out a breath. "It isn't that easy." Lala let a sad smile touch her lips. "Life is complicated." She turned to Harlan. "Do you have anything for her?" He narrowed his eyes. "Why do you keep giving away my collection?" Lala placed a fist on her waist and raised an eyebrow at Harlan. "Our collection. Now hand it over." If this was slavery between dragons and their mate, she could see what Victor meant when he said it was about owning each other. Harlan sighed and a small flash of blue light revealed he had brought a small box into reality. It was decorated with carvings of the Han on the sides. He handed it to her and said, "This should be helpful. Now we have to leave. We can't be here when this all goes down, or they will accuse us of having a hand in it. Even if we did." Looking significantly at the box in her hands, she wondered what they had given her. He returned to the dressing room, probably to finish packing. Lala patted her hand that was around the box and said, "It will work out." Rain hated that Charles' sentiment was echoed when all Rain could see was death and darkness. "I've heard that, but I can't see it." Chapter 18. Catherine patted the covered cart and said to Everett, "He's ready." Catherine smiled at Rain and said, "Don't be so worried. This will work." Rain had always known that when society let her down, there was one bastion that never failed her. Family. She hadn't gone to her parents but instead her siblings. In this case, their expertise for trouble was in need. But her family always had her back, no matter how mad her plan was. "This is crazy," Rain countered, though she was aware it was their only option if they wanted to save Victor and her career at the same time. Everett lifted the handle of the cart and said, "Come on guys, we need to be in place before the crowds appear." He started moving without waiting to see if they were ready. Catherine stayed behind as she had a different role to play. She held the box that Harlan and Lala had given them and smiled at them as Rain and Everett went outside the gale to where the gallows stood. It was early. Even the bakers weren't out yet on the way to work. It could technically be considered night time by most people's standards. Rain tugged her black coat close around her against the cold. The gallows sat lonely in the courtyard outside the gale. It was one of the few still left for the amusement of the crowds. Other gales had started holding their executions inside their walls. The public uproar had convinced the authorities that a public execution was for the better. For Rain, it meant they had a chance to come up with an 11th-hour rescue. Everett crouched down by the platform of the gallows and lifted the trapdoor. He scrambled inside. Rain hesitated but went for the cart and took out the item covered in the canvas and slid it into the gap under the gallows. Everett pulled it in, his hands the only part of him she could see in the shadows. Rain hid the cart in a courtyard a block over and returned to the gallows. Everett lay on the ground with his head out of the hole. He called, "It is going to be a tight fit." She crouched to fit in next to him. There was barely any space. They moved until the trapdoor wasn't obstructed by their bodies. It was going to be an uncomfortable stay, but one necessary for their plans. Also, a lot safer to go with this than any other plan they had discussed. She had called the mission crazy, but it was well thought out and all risks minimized as much as possible. It would also mean no one would know she played a part in Victor's rescue, and that would mean her career was safe. Everett asked into the silence, "Are you going to marry him?" She could have scolded him to be silent, but there was no one outside who could possibly hear them yet. "Let's rescue him first before you start planning the wedding." He chuckled at her sharp retort, but kept quiet. A while later they could hear people outside gathering around the gallows, ready for the spectacle that would happen later in the day. Rain tugged on the collar around her neck. It was getting stuffy in the small space as the sun rose and beat on the wooden slats above. It was too tight to remove her coat, so she would have to suffer the heat. She could make out the shape of Everett on the other side of the space, but the item they had dragged in here was between them and obscured him. With the lack of light, she couldn't make out his features though. When the noise made by the crowd would cover whatever noise they made when they started moving the last pieces into place. They covered themselves and the item in black cloth and shifted everything so they wouldn't be seen when the trapdoor dropped. They had a little food, but Rain only nibbled as she knew they were going to be there for hours with no chance of privacy from her brother. Footsteps on the wood above them heralded that the main event was about to begin. Her heart beat so hard in her ears that she didn't hear them bringing Victor onto the platform. She jumped when the magistrate slammed a cane on the floorboards, slapping a hand over her mouth so she didn't make a noise as he droned out the accusations against Victor. The hangman brought Victor over the trapdoor, his frame casting gaps of shadow and light as they shifted him to where they could slip the noose around his neck. His head was covered with a hood, so Rain couldn't even try to see what he was feeling, not that she could make out much with the awkward angle and obstruction of the platform. The crowd were extraordinarily loud as they jeered. Usually it was directed towards the hangman, but this time it was towards Victor. When the hanging commenced, it shocked her enough that she jerked with surprise. The trapdoor dropped and Rain couldn't help gasping. Victor's feet came into view and flailed around. Rain muttered, "Now, Catherine." Even though her sister wouldn't be able to hear her. A whistle pierced the sky and then a bang had the people on the platform above them scrambling for cover. Rain hissed, "Now." Shooting into action, they uncovered themselves and she rolled so she was under Victor, his feet finding purchase on her shoulders, and she rose a little. He slipped and gagged above her. Eventually he found his footing. He still struggled to breathe above her as the noose had already tightened and didn't easily come loose, but he wasn't gagging. She closed her eyes, glad that the hangman had a penchant for not setting the knot to break a person's neck. Charles at least had been a font of knowledge on the procedures around executions. There were more whistles and bangs, and Rain could see that the crowd had also gone for cover. No one would see that Victor was no longer strangling. His foot slipped again, but he caught himself. Everett cursed and said, "A little higher." She arched her back, lifting Victor up a little more and taking the tension off the rope. Everett called, "Now." She moved, rolling again into the shadows cast under the platform. Victor slipped off her back and slumped into the hole of the trapdoor. Crouching, she rolled Victor, who still had the hood and his hands tied, so he was further under the platform. The noose no longer around his throat, he could at least breathe easily, so she didn't have to worry about him suffocating. She grabbed the item Catherine had given up for this rescue mission and wedged it under her shoulder. Everett caught hold of it and helped with the dead weight. He slipped the noose over the covered face of the body and then they both dropped down into the trapdoor. The body swung from their manhandling. Her heart beat so loud that she couldn't hear the fireworks anymore. She rolled further into the shadows and pressed up against Victor's side. She covered the two of them with the black cloth, hiding them from a casual view from above. Everett crouched in the small space made by the trapdoor. He struck a flint and applied it to the pants leg of the dangling body. A whoosh above them and the heat told her that the body had caught as easily as Catherine had insisted it would. Apparently, many of the chemicals she had used to preserve the body would aid in its combustibleness. Everett took his own place again under the platform in the shadows. The cries from people were still in fear of the fireworks. None were about their body-switching antics. The fireworks stopped as suddenly as they started. Officials rushed onto the platform, but the flames kept them back. The flames finally caught on the rope and the body slammed down onto the platform. Its legs were in the hole, but most of it above them on the slats of the platform. Rain gagged at the smell of cooking flesh. She shifted the cover over them more as melted flesh dripped on them through the gaps in the floorboards. A splash of water drenched them more than the body aflame above them. She tightened her arms around Victor and whispered, "Keep still and quiet." She felt the nod of his head rather than saw it. The weight was harder than the one before. Bobbies and other officials studied the now charred body, but at least no longer on fire, on the platform. The officials muttered to themselves. One swore and said, "Freaky dragon stuff." Another said, "I didn't know they burst into flame when they died." The first answered, "Who knows? One hasn't died in a long time." As she hoped, they assumed the fire was a dragon thing. She had hoped if they hadn't believed dragons were weird that they would assume whoever had set off the fireworks had also managed to set fire to the body. It was better not to try to anticipate people's conclusions. The burning had been essential to cover the tattoos and the clear difference in facial features between the dead pirate and Victor. The burnt remains were eventually taken away. The commotion went on longer than she expected even after the body was taken away.